In 1950, a dead body was discovered in Tolland, Denmark. It was a man. He was naked, apart from a belt and a leather cap. The rope around his neck aroused suspicions that this man had not died a natural death. Was he murdered? And if so, why?
This is one of the best preserved bodies from ancient times, and it's an absolutely incredible find. The injuries indicate that he was either hanged or strangulated.
There's a lot of strangling going on, a lot of garrotting and a lot of placing of people in marshes.
At first glance, this stunningly lifelike face would suggest that this was a recent death. But this man died over 2,000 years ago. The acidic properties of the Tolland marsh waters have preserved his features so amazingly well that 2 millennia after his death, we may be able to piece together his final hours. With the help of modern technology, Danish forensic anthropologist Niels Linderup is going to reopen one of his country's oldest and most famous murder cases. These peaceful bogs in rural Denmark have for generations provided fuel for the local people in the form of peat. Peat consists of roots, branches, leaves and seeds, partly decayed by the wetland water. When cut into blocks and dried out, it can be burned as fuel. In 1950, 2 men who were extracting peat unearthed the body of a naked man with a leather rope around his neck. Had he been strangled and dumped in the marsh? The men notified the police, fearing that they had uncovered a murder victim. Their fears were soon confirmed, but with a surprising twist. It was a murder, but it had taken place more than 2,000 years ago. Niels Linderup is a leading forensic anthropologist. He's examined both ancient and modern human remains, from the ice mummies of Greenland to the mass graves of Kosovo. Like all Danes, he has long been familiar with one of his country's most famous treasures. By applying the latest forensic technology, Niels intends to add a new and exciting chapter to the story. If he can establish exactly how the Tolland man died, he might be able to unravel one of the Iron Age's great mysteries.
After he was discovered, they performed some radiocarbon tests, which showed that he, in fact, was a very ancient person. He lived around or just before the time of Christ. Also, they found a rope around his neck, so obviously it seemed he had been hanged or maybe strangled. And this again raised the question of whether he had been murdered, or had he been executed for some crime, or had he been sacrificed? And I'm hoping that some of the new technologies we'll be able to use now will help us answer some of these questions.
The region of Jutland, on Denmark's largest island, is a place of wild marshlands and picturesque fjords and inlets. Silkeborg is one of its historic towns. Its museum is where the Tolland man now rests. Visitors travel from all over the world to come face to face with a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago. His expression is so calm and peaceful, it looks as if he may only be sleeping. Soon, thanks to modern technology, we may understand more about this unique life and death. Niels is leading a team of top scientists who are about to disturb the Tolland man's slumber for the first time in 50 years. His remains will be subject to the latest scientific techniques, bringing them ever closer to establishing once and for all whether this was a case of murder, execution, or something far darker, human sacrifice.
We'll be taking the Tolland man out of the museum to the nearby university hospital, and there we'll be performing a lot of analysis using some of the latest and most advanced medical technology.
It's a tense moment as the team carefully remove the Tolland man from the bulletproof glass casing that has protected him for 50 years. Removing his head from the body requires a steady pair of hands. All that remains intact of the Tolland man are his remarkably preserved head and one of his feet. On display is a cast of how it looked when it was first found in 1950. With limited preservation techniques in the early days, they concentrated their efforts on saving the head. Even his hair has survived. 2,500 years of lying submerged in peaty waters has dyed it red. Next begins a journey that will bring us closer to this man who lived about 400 years before Christ was born. The remains of the Tolland man are carried through the museum for transportation to Aarhus Hospital, a few kilometers away. Everyone is eager to understand more about this Iron Age man and his life and times. This is an anxious time for curator Christian Fischer. A police escort goes some way to reassure him that the Tolland man will arrive safely. Months of careful preparation have gone into receiving surely one of the most unusual patients this hospital has ever admitted. The national media is out in force to cover this once-in-a-lifetime event. These cutting-edge techniques in archaeological science will increase our understanding of Iron Age peoples. X-rays may reveal disease, injury, and provide clues as to exactly how the Tolland man died. Nothing shows up to definitively answer whether he was hanged or strangled, so further tests will be needed. The X-rays show no signs of physical trauma to the skull that might have been sustained at the time of death. A high-definition video camera reveals minute details on the Tolland man's foot. The team are amazed by the high degree of preservation. Even the tiniest scars from when he walked barefoot are visible. Such remarkable preservation is due to special conditions found in bogs. Organic acids in the layers of the decaying plant material can preserve the soft tissues of a dead body, so the skin, gut, brains, and hair are as if frozen in time.
I think he's so special because, in a sense, he is so ordinary. We're not looking at a king from the ancient times. We're looking at a perfectly ordinary human being who just happens to be exceptionally well preserved.
The main event of this forensic inquiry is a CT scan of the head. This will record every detail on computer so that the body may never have to be disturbed again. But it may also help Niels solve the mystery of the cause of death. The press are there to witness this unique event. This is a Danish star getting the true paparazzi treatment.
I mean, this allows us to exactly see the state of preservation and the state of tissues and perhaps also even get a bit closer analysis on cause of death in terms of hanging and the damage to the internal organs and the throat and so on.
There's more excitement as a team of scientists gather to see the initial results. This collecting of evidence is bringing Niels a step closer to solving this ancient crime. The CT scan takes a cross-sectional image of the head from top to bottom. The data will then be processed to create 3D digital images of the head. Niels will soon be able to study these at his computer to try to establish how the Tolland man died. One day these images will be available online, giving us the opportunity to sit face to face with one of the ancients. An endoscope is used for the next part of the investigation. The tiny camera on the end of the probe could provide images showing internal damage to the throat. If we can find out how the Tolland man died, we may be able to understand why. but the thick wax used in the 1950s for preservation has blocked access to the inside of the throat.
The esophagus was also closed, so we could not come in. It should be here, in front of this area here.
A route is found, however, up through the spinal canal to the brain. The X-rays have already revealed its surprising survival, and now we can get even closer to it. The team are amazed to discover that the surface of this ancient brain is in immaculate condition.
So we have not expected to see the surface of the brain. Here you see a sulcus. You see this groove here. It's a groove between two parts of the brain.
We've now been able to look more closely at the brain using this technique, and it really is exceptionally well preserved. We can clearly see a lot of the structures of the brain surface. However, on the other hand, what is preserved is the form and not actually the internal structures and like cells or grey matter, white matter. We've not been able to differentiate those structures.
Damage, disease or hemorrhage would have shown up in a more recent example, but despite the Tolland man's brain having been almost pickled by the acidic bog waters, it gives no clues as to the cause of death. All we are seeing is a fossilized form. Few, if any, brain cells that would provide any significant evidence have survived. It has always been assumed that the rope around the Tolland man's neck was the instrument of death. But was he hanged, strangled, or even dragged by the rope until he choked and died? Niels believes that if he can establish exactly how the man met his end, we may learn more about the reason for his death: murder, punishment, or ritual killing. Thoroughly examining the head using both infrared and UV lights can highlight details such as scars or tattoos that might not be visible in normal lighting conditions. The process also allows Niels to study the strangulation injuries of the Tolland man in minute detail in an attempt to identify the probable cause of death.
The thing is, if he's been hanged, which means the noose would kind of go up in an inverted V, or he was strangulated by simply, standing or lying, and then there would be a circular furrow.
The initial inspection under infrared light suggests that hanging was the most likely cause of death. But Niels won't know for sure until the CT scan images are processed, when he will be able to see the neck bones in 3D. The team are almost at the end of their forensic investigations. It is now a time of reflection. The Tolland man can be returned to his resting place at the Silkeborg Museum. With the data gathered using state-of-the-art medical technology, he may never need to be disturbed again. While Niels waits for the processing of the CT scan images, he considers the fate of this ordinary man. Has he come closer to understanding the reason for the Tolland man's death?
Of course, one of the other questions is, why had he been killed? Is this simply a murder case? Or perhaps was he punished for something he'd done? Or was this part of a greater ritualistic setting? Maybe a sacrifice to the gods?
Murder, punishment, or ritual killing. The CT scan images will reveal the Tolland man's secrets in time. The rather more intriguing question is, why did he have to die? Forensic anthropologist Niels Linnerup is on a murder hunt. The remains of the Tolland man, brutally killed over 2,000 years ago, have aroused the attention of the scientific world. But who was he, and why did he have to die? And why were his remains placed in a peat bog? Bogs in this part of the world have long been considered sacred places, perhaps because of their mysterious ability to preserve dead bodies, or the fact that they represent the transition between land and water, a place where life meets the afterlife, or the world of man meets the world of the gods. All kinds of ancient offerings have been discovered in bogs, from valuable pots and animal bones to human bodies. Many bog bodies have been found in Europe. The Winderby girl from northern Germany was discovered blindfolded with half of her head shaven. In Ireland, the Gala man was found interred with suspicious artifacts around his body, a deerskin cape fastened tightly around his neck. At Veerdinge in Holland, a couple were found locked in an embrace, one of the couple's intestines spilling out from a knife injury. Like the Tolland man, they all have one gruesome thing in common. They were all victims of violent death. But in many cases, the final resting position of the body contradicts the brutality of the death. Christian Fischer, curator of the Silkeborg Museum, is convinced that the careful arrangement of the Tolland man's body in the bog holds a vital clue.
So perhaps his survivors has arranged him exactly like a sleeping person. They also bent his arm and his legs exactly like a sleeping child when they put him out in the bog. And that demonstrates for me that he was a sacrifice.
Could this rule out murder or punishment? Similar ancient killings have been identified elsewhere. A clear pattern of bizarre ritual deaths seems to be emerging here. Could it be sacrifice? British archaeologist Miranda Aldhouse-Green is an expert in northern European bog bodies. She believes that these are cases of human sacrifice.
I don't think human sacrifice was ever common in Iron Age Europe, but it happens repeatedly, persistently over a long period of time, and there are certain similarities. There's a lot of strangling going on, a lot of garrotting, and a lot of placing of people in marshes.
The Iddy girl found in a peat bog in Holland, although not as well preserved as a Tolland man, is still a striking sight. The circumstances of her burial bear startling similarities to that of the Tolland man. The rope around her throat and the careful burial position. Can the Iddy girl provide us with any clues?
One possibility is that she was a scapegoat sacrifice. Now that's something which is known in many societies, where you get a particular individual who's chosen by the community to have all the sins, all the impurities, all the problems of that community heaped onto one person, who is then either driven out or sacrificed in order that the community would be purified and all the problems would go away. And that might explain why you've still got the rope around her neck, which would have been a sign of, in a sense, degradation, humiliation, the fact that the rope was still around her throat and she died and she was buried like that. Perhaps to show the world, to show the gods, that here was somebody who was punished for the sins of the community.
Was the Tolland man punished for the sins of his community? In his gut, there was another crucial clue.
Found inside his stomach and intestines were the remains of his last meal. And this seems to have been a sort of a gruel. There were traces of vegetables, cultivated grains, and also various wild seeds such as linseed, barley, and chamomile.
On inspection, it was revealed that the barley was infected with ergot, a fungus which, when ingested, acts like a hallucinogenic drug.
Tolland man's especially interesting because they found infected barley in his gut, and that is really quite significant because infected barley has ergot, a kind of fungus growing on it, and that can cause wild hallucinations, convulsions, the whole body to burn hot, and people who'd ingested ergot would have behaved in a really, really weird way, as if they were possessed by evil spirits.
Perhaps these hallucinations caused him to be marked out as someone special or threatening. Was he considered to be possessed and slain by his own community? But barley was just one of many foods found in a Tolland man's stomach. Bog moss leaves, oats, seeds and flax were also part of his final meal, ingredients that may have had special significance to the peoples of the Iron Age. This was a Last Supper, especially prepared for his journey to the other world.
Cereal in general, and perhaps barley in particular, may have been used as a kind of a prisoner's last meal before they were sacrificed, because you find barley in terms of cakes or gruel in a lot of the bog bodies. And it was perhaps the case that special food, barley was maybe special and not eaten every day, but was considered as almost as a kind of sacred last rite.
The infected barley is crucial evidence. It suggests that the Tolland man was not simply murdered, but singled out for ceremonial execution. Copenhagen, the Danish capital, is home to the Panum Institute with its famous anthropology department. Niels Linderup has now received all the hospital forensic data. The 3D CT scan images now provide Niels with conclusive answers as to exactly how the Tolland man died. Was he hanged, or was he strangled? Manual strangulation would have fractured the hyoid bone, located just below the tongue and green here on the digital image. The Adam's apple cartilage, brown on the screen, would also have been damaged. The new research has revealed that these parts of the throat did not suffer any trauma.
So this indicates he was not strangled. And as for hanging, it's quite consistent with hanging, and also with the noose being placed very high up on his neck, just below the mandible.
So it has now been confirmed once and for all that the Tolland man died from hanging, not strangulation. Perhaps what we see as a barbaric act today was for Iron Age peoples their only way of appeasing the gods. Life was harsh for the Tolland man's community. Famine, disease, warfare, or some other crisis threatened their very existence. Their only answer was to offer the ultimate gift to the gods, a human life.
The Tolland man, it seems, was selected by his community to die. Maybe he fulfilled a function as a scapegoat for some problem facing his community, failed crops, something like that. The day before he died, he was given a special meal, crammed with special ingredients.
A sacred final meal for a man who may even have given himself up for sacrifice to benefit his people.
On his final day, he was taken out, and the leather rope was placed around his neck, and he was hanged. There were no signs of struggle. I think basically he accepted his fate. Maybe it was even an honor for him. Afterwards he was taken down, and then his people laid him to rest very carefully in the bog.
Thanks to modern technology, we now know exactly how this Iron Age man met his end. Despite the shocking violence of his death, it may be that the Tolland man did not die in vain. Perhaps his death helped to cement the faith of his community, giving them strength to face the future. 2,400 years later, his power is still deeply felt. On a sandy beach on Canada's southern coast, a fragment of tattered rag caught the attention of a local inhabitant. On closer inspection, he saw what looked like a splintered coffin and human bone.
It was a person of short stature with very distinctive kind of curly, kinky hair.
The remains showed other intriguing traits, including what looked like a terrible injury.
One would assume that there would have been some pain involved just in a very quick death like that.
Who was this? What were they doing here? And why were they buried in a shallow seaside grave? And does the apparent severe injury to the arm point to a suspicious death? Experts have been called in to investigate this intriguing find.
Accident, drowning.
Accidental fall,
Yeah.
accidentally shot.
Through detailed analysis, they are determined to uncover the mystery of how this body came to be buried on a beach in Newfoundland.
This person was not local. So what were they doing there?
Along the sandy shoreline of the Straits of Belle Isle lies the quiet fishing community of Lons-Olu. It was established in the early 18th century and flourished as one of the many little settlements along this coast that fished and traded in sea cod. It was here in the late 20th century that the remains of a mysterious burial were found emerging from the sand dunes. Historical archaeologist Dr. Jim Tuck from the Memorial University of Newfoundland was called in to coordinate the delicate removal of the remains.
In a sandbank next to the cemetery, which was eroding, we could see what looked like the foot of a coffin with some human bones eroding out of the bank. And so we just removed the nice soft sand from it and slid it onto a piece of plywood and gone.
Once the body was removed from its sandy grave, Jim was able to reach some initial conclusions. From the simple wooden coffin, shroud and clothing fragments, it was clear to the trained eye that this was not a recent grave.
We could see, as soon as we got it exposed, that it was indeed a human skeleton, probably sometime from the late 18th or early 19th century, and that it was a person of very short stature with very distinctive kind of curly, kinky hair.
Found with the skeleton were a number of grave goods, adding to the mystery of this burial. A pair of shoes had been placed either side of the skull. A full set of clothes, still in excellent condition, and some tools were strewn throughout the coffin. But it was the hair that would be the key piece of evidence. Dr. Sonia Jerkic is an osteologist based in Newfoundland across the strait from the find. She's helped solve modern murder cases for the Mounties and the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. But she's been asked to investigate the intriguing case of this ancient body found on the beach. The first thing that strikes her is that the deceased was buried with clothing and other grave goods.
It looks really interesting because in addition to the coffin and the skeleton, they tell me that there are other pieces, possibly even clothing, that's been found on top of the skeleton. And this is not what you'd normally expect from a historic burial. So I'd really be curious to see what all of this might mean.
Sonia is determined to find out who this was, what they were doing here, and how they came to die in what could have been violent circumstances. What strikes her immediately is that the skull looks to have distinctive negroid features.
Some of the more notable features would be in the outline of the nasal opening, where your nose would have been. In people of African heritage, you're dealing with a much broader opening here relative to the length, and so quite a wide nasal opening, as compared to somebody of European heritage, where this nasal opening is much narrower. The bridge of the nose projects outward more, and it also tends to be narrower right where it meets the frontal bone or the rest of the skull.
This is a puzzle to the archaeologist, as the presence of a person of African descent in this time and place would have been extremely rare. Sonia has sent off the few strands of hair that were luckily preserved in the grave for analysis. This will confirm the individual's genetic background one way or the other. Meanwhile, she wants to conduct a thorough forensic analysis of the entire skeleton. Laying out the skeletal remains of the body in the correct anatomical position and undertaking a full forensic examination will begin to answer some important questions. A beautifully preserved skull like this can reveal vital clues about the sex and age, but also a whole lot more.
Much as a living face provides an identity and what you can learn about a person who is living, likewise we can find the same kinds of information in a skull from somebody who is deceased.
She begins looking at the skull to see if she can identify the sex of this person.
Overall, it's a relatively small skull, which you might expect if it were a female that it would be small.
Though at first glance the skull looks feminine, closer inspection tells Sonia a different story.
In spite of the size, when you start looking at some of the other areas, the muscle attachment behind the ear here, which is quite pronounced, and the mandible too, you can see the angle here at the back, and see how that flares out?
Oh, okay.
and it just wings out almost, and you've got a muscle attaching there going up. So in terms of sex, just based on a cursory look, we could probably say that we're dealing with a male.
The sutures, the lines where different bones in the skull meet, aren't fused, telling Sonia that this was a young adult. The teeth will help her to assess his age more accurately.
We've got good indications of an adult because we've got the wisdom tooth, both sides, present in the lower jaw, likewise in the upper jaw. So we're dealing with an adult.
But not a mature adult. The dental eruption and attrition confirms the assessment made from the skull, that this man was in his early 20s. The good condition of the teeth also show that this was a pretty healthy person. Sonia now concentrates on the most disturbing feature of the skeleton. The lower left arm bones are missing. All that remains is a short stump. Although both feet were also missing, this can be explained by natural deterioration in the grave. But the arm tells a different story.
This bone is usually paired up with another bone in your forearm. And what one would normally expect to find is either a portion or a complete paired bone that belongs to the forearm as well. But here, all we have left is a stub of one of the bones, the ulna, and the hand is totally lacking.
Sonia is confident that erosion and decomposition alone cannot explain these missing bones. But what could explain the loss of this limb?
This is a real puzzle to me, whether it was accident or design that might have caused what can only have been an injury. And it's making me think about what may have ultimately played a part in how this individual died.
So had the arm been surgically amputated, or had it been torn off in an accident, or even hacked off in a fight? A high-powered microscope could provide some answers. The tip of the bone had undergone some erosion while in the ground, but there is enough detail left to convince Sonia that surgical amputation is out of the question. Sonia now knows that the limb was severed either by accident or violence. Such an injury would surely have been fatal. Although she has been able to work out the likely cause of death of this otherwise fit and healthy individual, Sonia is still none the wiser about who this man was and how he came to be buried on a windswept beach in southern Canada. Results of the analysis on the hair are back, confirming the archaeologist's initial hunch that this was a person of African descent.
I was hesitating to say that specifically from the features on the skull because it would be very unusual to find someone of black ancestry buried in Newfoundland. When we find any burials, any skeletons from Newfoundland or Labrador, they will generally either be First Nations, Aboriginal peoples who were here when Europeans first arrived, or they will be people of European ancestry.
No other skeletons of people of African descent have been discovered within the province. Historically, this part of the Americas was not an area where slaves were held. Neither was this a place of choice for black immigration or settlement after the American Civil War. So the isolated burial of this young African descendant here in Labrador is a puzzle.
The idea that one would find a skeleton in southern Labrador of someone with black ancestry would have been very unusual. But this is somebody who is of black ancestry. And what were they doing there?
Careful study of his clothing and grave goods may help Sonia determine why this man of African heritage was here and how he met an early and seemingly violent death. The mystery of a young man buried on the southern Canadian coast during the early 19th century is being investigated by archaeologist Dr. Sonia Jerkig. What's strange about this case is that he was a man of African descent, a very rare occurrence at this time in this place. Also, his left arm had been violently wrenched off. Sonia's next line of inquiry brings her to the clothing and tools found in the coffin. such as a short-pointed wooden stake and a knife. Lining the clothes up beside the skeleton is a clear demonstration that they must have fitted and therefore belonged to the deceased. Conservator Kathy Mateus has painstakingly restored and studied the clothes in the hope that she will be able to give Sonia some answers as to the young man's identity.
And we're going to move the sleeves and put them in place.
Sonia is hoping that
Just hold
Kathy
that
will be
for a
able to identify exactly when this man lived and died.
So hey, we have a few things that we can use to figure out who this person was, and we'll start sort of with the textiles.
She starts by looking at his jacket.
If we start with the double-breasted feature of the jacket and the fact that there's a button front or a support which is added because there would be several buttons lining both sides. And if you fold this flat back, you can see the cut of it is sort of what they referred to as an M cut. And so you're really getting a little bit of style to the jacket. There's no side piece here. It's one cut right around, and then you have a little back piece at the back.
So nothing like a gusset or whatever in
No
there.
gusset there yet. So that keeps it early in the 19th century.
So, this young man met his end around 200 years ago. The design of the trousers, broad, fall-fronted, suggests a date of pre-1830. Kathy knows that he wouldn't have lived before the 19th century, as one of the great innovations of menswear in the 19th century was the introduction of trousers. The costume tells Kathy that this was a working man, and she thinks she can identify his area of work.
I think this costume must belong to a sailor of some description.
A fisherman? Navy?
Well, given that they were in the harbor of Lancelot, which certainly until recent times was very, very rich for codfish, probably more of a merchant ship.
The costume also indicates the young man's rank on board ship.
Within that period, this would lean more towards a working person's costume, not really a high status.
It wasn't uncommon for African men to work on ships, and he was the right age for a seafarer at this time. The presence in the coffin of the wooden stake, a marlin spike used by ordinary seamen to untangle and unknot ropes, seems to confirm the theory that he was low-ranking. However, forensic analysis contradicts this conclusion. His bones suggest that he was not involved in strenuous physical activity, nor did he suffer the poor diet endured by ordinary sailors. The jacket buttons also point to a higher rank.
You can see they're brass with a little bit of silver plate on them. And actually, the Earth Science Department here did some analysis for us, and we do know that is silver on them. So slightly high-class buttons, which you may not have expected from possibly a sailor.
So the buttons indicate that he held a higher rank than an ordinary seaman. If he had worked on a naval ship, he may have been an officer's servant who could afford silver buttons and who enjoyed a better diet and less strenuous work than the ordinary sailors. But the shoes found in the grave provide another tantalizing clue to his identity.
And this leather shoe is also well preserved. And if you look at the back, you can see this W carved into it.
In a time when such objects would be valuable, this would be an obvious way of claiming ownership. Another item found in the coffin bore a similar identifying mark.
This is his pocket knife, and look at what is carved onto the handle.
There's another W there.
There is, and what do you think? It could be an H.
Oh, wow, like initials.
That's right.
Which go back to the shoe.
That's right.
So, whoever this man was seemed to have the initial W, probably WH. Given the fact that his shoes and clothes would have been useful items for his surviving shipmates, it's a mystery as to why they were buried with this man. Sonia has built up a picture of how this man lived, and possibly how he met his death.
So I know we have a young male who was a sailor. Somewhere along the line, this fellow lost his arm. He may have lost an arm in conflict aboard ship or in an accident. And if you think aboard ship, you might have lost it in the rigging. Ropes can get tangled up. You can get your arm tangled up in that, and it can just be literally cut off. After that, you could bleed out, what they would say today, and just loss of blood would have made you so weak that you would die very quickly.
What is still puzzling Sonia is why he was buried on land, as she knows that the tradition among mariners was a sea burial. Returning to the university, she meets Kathy to search through the Maritime History Archive. They're hoping that they might be able to find the young man's identity and discover a reason for his burial on land. The archive is a record of maritime activities in the North Atlantic since the 15th century. Included are accidents and deaths. They're hoping to find a record of W.H.'s death.
They don't fit.
They begin by looking for surnames beginning with H, and then for forenames beginning with W. Having no success through the names, they then focus on records of accidents or deaths that may make a reference to an arm injury.
Accident. Drowning.
Lung fever.
Lung fever. Drowning.
Drowning.
Yeah, a lot of drowning.
Accidental fall.
Yeah.
So far, none of the accidents seem to say anything about losing a limb, a hand, anything along those lines.
No.
Accidentally shot.
Yeah.
No.
But no, there's another accident. Drown.
Mostly drowning.
Unfortunately, again, this doesn't throw up any obvious leads, but it does reveal something pertinent to the case. Contrary to Sonia's assumption, it was actually quite common for sailors to be buried on dry land.
You do see that they're not buried at sea. They're brought to land.
Brought to land. So W.H. may not have been as unusual as I thought.
No, I think that was more typical.
I spend too much time in the movies, I think. Jeez.
The one thing that is still puzzling Sonia is why W.H. was buried with his clothes and tools. It was usual practice to auction off a sailor's personal items among his comrades. His workmates could then make use of his things, while his family was able to make use of the money raised. Kathy suggests that maybe the rest of the crew thought his clothing was unclean in some way.
But you know, the fact that the textiles show so little wear and they were kind of thrown in, don't you think that sort of makes you think that there was some sort of disease and maybe they wanted him off that ship fast?
That's a good alternate explanation, but since I deal with the bones, I've got to go with what I see on the skeleton, and I have to keep coming back to that left arm that isn't there. If that happened around the time of death...
Sonia is convinced that huge blood loss or infection caused by such a terrible injury must have been the cause of death, rather than disease. Sonia thinks it's more likely that he was buried with his belongings out of respect.
You know, looking over these slides again, it just becomes more and more obvious that some people, somebody took an awful lot of time and energy to bury this fellow.
For Sonia, her investigation is almost over. But finally, she wants to get the opinion of Jim Tuck, the man who led the original dig.
I'm hoping Jim might be able to give me some clues about what life might have been like in the Strait of Belle Isle for a black sailor and how he might have ended up dying and being buried in that desolate place.
Sonia reveals the new evidence she's gleaned concerning this intriguing burial.
Kathy and I have come up with some good stuff. I've been looking over the skeleton and we've determined that...
But she'd now like to know what life was like for W.H. before he met his end.
I guess by our standards, life aboard any sailing vessel at that time was probably not a stroll in the park. Life was pretty tough, but in any case, I would guess that black seamen were probably not very high up in the hierarchy of things.
This sailor must have had a hard life. Could this have contributed to the loss of his arm and ultimately his premature death? Jim seems to think that this might well be the case.
Well, I suppose a fall from the rigging could have done it, or been tangled up in an anchor chain, or some sort of explosion if there were powder aboard. Maybe he was bit by a bear. There certainly were white bears around there at that time, so it could be almost anything. And unless there's some evidence on the bone, I think, again, it's just pure speculation.
Without that crucial piece of evidence, we may never know precisely how W.H. lost his arm. But one thing is certain, that he received a respectful, even honored burial with all his belongings. For Sonia, the accidental discovery of an ancient grave has given her a valuable glimpse into the life and times of a sailor, a man of African descent, from about 200 years ago. She is now able to draw some conclusions about who this man was, and how easily a young life could be brought to a premature end on board a working ship.
Starting from a few bits of coffin crumbling out of a sandbank in Labrador, I now know that a young black seaman was sailing around Newfoundland. One day, he lost his arm. He may have died immediately. He may have taken a few days to succumb. His mates gathered his gear together, fashioned a coffin, took him ashore, and buried him in a grave in Lansalou, and sailed away, leaving behind the remains of a young man whose family may never have known how he died or where he was finally laid to rest.